Hi, this is Gary from Jungian Online here with Andre Koning, and we're going to have just a little chat and just get into your background with Jung and some of the most basic sort of concepts of the Jungian world. So let's just start with when you were first gripped by Jung. What was the spark that set you off?
Well, as you know, for a little bit from my background, I was very interested in phenomenology, as a psychologist. But of course, that didn't go well in combination with the quantitative approach to psychology that we all had to suffer in a way. That was the main approach. So that whole question about, well, when we talk about phenomena or anxiety, for instance, if you talk about anxiety in psychology, the question was usually not what is anxiety or how do we understand the world of a phobic patient when the walls are falling over or seems to fall over. No, we start measuring and we start looking at physiological stuff like, when you're angry, you secrete noradrenaline. When you're anxious, this and that happens. Yes. But it still doesn't answer that kind of question. So the whole issue of explaining versus understanding in phenomenology, that really always spoke to me. Said, well, I want to understand. I don't want to explain all the time. It's useful in its context, but if you want to really understand a patient or people you work with and understand their lives, we have to go elsewhere. So phenomenology was very important, and one of the things that triggered is when they were explaining things in a Freudian way, so for in-depth psychology, I still had the feeling from, well, it's all very interesting, but it's still explaining. It's not really understanding. So you can explain away, say, somebody, that classical example of a key in a door lock, has to fit in a certain theory, say a Freudian theory, so therefore it has to do with the sexual unity or the primal scene or whatever. But in phenomenology, like Nedad Boss, he would say, no, let's first look at what a key and a lock actually mean. And he was talking about opening new possibilities, opening a portal, opening a door. And that came already quite close to what I understood in a conversation with a colleague, what Jung was doing. So I started to read Jung. I thought, this is not explaining. He's talking about being very empirical, but actually is much more on the level of understanding. So his width of perspective and his way of not reducing everything like a symbol to one or two meanings, but doing the opposite, a different kind of hermeneutics, like making it richer where the symbol can mean so many things. And in its context, it will become clear. That led to something like, Jung himself is opening portals, with one of those titles of a book, Doors of Perception, the old Aldous Huxley. So that's what it's about. If you want to understand consciousness, or you want to understand a book like Doors of Perception, we're looking at consciousness, we're looking at unconscious influences, etc. And the whole world opens up if you start to unlock that. So I did Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his own biography, how he experienced things. That all started to speak to me. And then I got into quickly already. It was fairly early on in my career. As I'd been to Duquesne University in Pittsburgh with phenomenology. I came back to Europe. That started my first job in England, and I started to read psychology and alchemy. So not because of a first interest in alchemy, but because he was actually looking at a series of dreams with lots of references to the collective unconscious, and that was that was eye-opening. It was great. So that's how it started when I was in my 20s.
Yeah, thank you. That gives the feel of it. And why don't you just try and give folks another taste of what you mean by Jung was about understanding more than explaining. I get what you mean, but why don't you give folks another taste of what that means to you?
Well, it means that Jung wasn't in the first place interested in reducing something to a particular small theory, you could say, boxed in.
Mm-hmm.
He was not boxing things into these little label categories. Like he himself said one day, he said, one day you might all get rid of those bottles that have labeled. You might get rid of the labels. It doesn't matter. You know, I'm using certain terms or concepts like the collective unconscious or the unconscious. But even then I thought, well, he's broad-minded enough to allow the unconscious to be an adjective as well. Unconsciously, I'm doing this and that. It doesn't have to be an entity. Like this is what is happening. And with understanding, you cannot do that, because in explaining, you want to grasp and hold. So now I've got a concept, I've understood. No, you've explained it. You've made a meaning that refers to some basic concept that you started out with, like in Freudian theory. Jung doesn't do that. He says, yes, sexuality, sure, it's very important, and drives and impulses are. But don't forget that an instinct has two poles. That was also very interesting. So he said, there is an animalistic, you could say, or a primitive animal kind of pole, but there is also a spiritual pole. Mm-hmm. And that is so different from Freud, who kept on reducing it to the animal level, to the biological level only. And that tension between the two gives much more room for understanding something rather than reducing.
Is there an example of that comes to mind for you, of how we can understand the tension, you know, maybe in an archetype or something between the animal and the spiritual?
Yeah, I think if you look at, so say a symbol of it could be a dream image, it could be something that belongs to the collective unconscious. If you look at, say, a little statue in India or in China that have something in common, like, for instance, the statues of Koning, goddess of wealth and prosperity, and so on, very important goddess. She stands on a dragon, and she has something at the top of the head that connects to the higher spiritual realm. But she's well grounded, because she's also connected to the level of the instincts of the world of the dragon. So there is a tension there between animalistic, primitive, drive, nature, as well as spirituality, heavenly, referring to the upper. And that tension between the two is so important, whether you're in China or in India, you will see those images. In the West, we might have had a tendency to split it off a bit more. And Maria has to be holy and virginal. And so that's something where we can see something goes wrong. But Jung pointed out when we split that off too much. It's only one pole and not the other. And that's a loss, really.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, I certainly understand when you're saying already that, you know, the difference between explaining and understanding for me is an archetypal feminine, archetypal masculine difference. And, you know, part of the illusion of our time, I think, is that the masculine falls into the, you know, idea that by mapping something that they've really conquered it, when they've just sort of made a map. And I think that's, you know, that's feminine masculine tension in the culture is really important, and really important in psychology, and why we choose the types of psychology we do.
Yes, I agree. Yes, that's a good example. Yes, the map is not the reality. It's a bit like that whole modern discussion about the brain. It's almost as if the neurologists who are doing valuable research with their own questions. But if the question is, what is consciousness? Or what do we call unconsciously? What are we talking about? We can't see it on the MRI scan or the map, where it's so you can't explain it. And when the question is actually about, I want to understand something. So it's two different discourses that keep mixing, getting intermingled, and therefore lead to endless discussions.
Yes.
You might as well say, let's see, do we want to understand what consciousness or unconscious is? Or are we going to measure first and see what comes up when we have a quantitative question?
Yeah, and that's very much almost, very much like the difference between the, maybe the priest and the mystic or something like that, or the professor and the mystic. The mystic
Right.
is having an experience of something.
Yes, that's what it's about. I think that's why Jung refers to the mystics and the poets who describe reality and their experience of the transcendental reality in a much different way. It's description rather than explanation. They describe in whether it's in a poetic way or in a very prosaic way, but they describe a reality that is rich and colorful.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to understand that makes a big difference in how the client is being received by the therapist. The way and the attitude with which you're sitting so profoundly different.
Yes, because it also leads to the idea of, well, what is it, the Jungian analysis, Jungian psychotherapy, these concepts, how do we deal with them in the practice room? That understanding or going through an analytic process is not understanding only at a cognitive level. Mm-hmm. It's not just a reflection on, what an interesting dream, now I understand it, and therefore I will change. Mm-hmm. No, it's not. The understanding and the analytic process is actually often very much to do with feelings and with emotions. Mm-hmm. It's often seen as analysis is analytic, so it's sort of a logical left hemisphere kind of activity.
Cold.
Bit of cold, yes. Whereas the opposite is the truth. When people said, no, I'm not going to do, people, you often hear that, no, psychologists are crazy anyway, and psychiatrists and psychoanalysts might be one degree worse. So we're going to analyze everything to bits. A little bit like the boy who was very interested when he was a 7-year-old boy. There was a fly, and he's going to dissect the corpse of the fly. And he's taking off the legs and the wings, and then he said, what's that? Now what is the fly? You've only got little parts.
Yeah.
That's an analytic approach, but analysis in its origin, it means to basically something, to use a metaphor of digesting something, not swallowing a whole a loaf of bread, but taking bit by bit to digest and emotionally digest and feel what it was to remember something again, or to step into a dream and feel what it's like, what the atmosphere is in the dream. Mm. And the same with transference, the crucial thing for us in analysis. Yeah? The transference is so unconscious, and it slowly becomes aware through the experience of the relationship. And that's usually much to do with atmosphere and feeling. Mm-hmm. And that we can understand by talking about what is happening. That helps us to integrate. But it doesn't work the other way around, that you start with cognitive insight and then the rest will filter through and automatically change one's feeling state for correct emotional experiences. So that's also part of understanding.
Yeah, and so, so illustrative of the difference between, a psychiatric approach where you are getting sort of dissected literally into a part. Oh, there's a part of your brain chemistry that's wrong, therefore you need this pill, instead of the holistic view, which is sitting there with the whole person and then entering into, a multidimensional process with them over time, and just participating in that two-ship for long enough that something happens, and that it isn't something that you're saying that we know what it's going to look like from the beginning. It's a journey that two people have that is unique every time.
Yes, and also the origin of the word therapeut from the Greek. It has something to do with being on the side of the other, like mateship. We are both going on a journey. Mm. We're both in step with each other until at a given moment I might start to come a little bit out of step. If we trust each other enough, I can go out a step a little bit and say, hey, there's something here that strikes me. You know, if you start to talk about some other side of the person. You know, we all want to learn about our shadow, for instance, but you can't just do that head on, because there will be lots of defenses. No, that's not true. That's other people. You know, when people study Jung and set up they become self-appointed teachers. You know, those groups of people who do not want to do any of the work, any of the journey themselves. They don't want to do analysis, but they already understand Jung because they've read Jung, and then start to apply it in their way without having done analysis, and thinking that cognitively they can understand what transference is, and you can't without experience. If that happens, then the shadow is constellated in a group like that, because they will not see their own shadow, and the danger is that they start to teach other people how it should be done, while the approach is often a mixture of something quite intellectual as well as something very emotional, without being integrated emotion, just like a devotion or an adoration for Jung, without seeing Jung's shadow, which we also should have a look at.
So you're thinking, I would think that partly what you're thinking of there might be a cult or something like that, or specifically Jungian groups.
So, yes, it can become quite cultic in the sense that that people who are drawn to cults, they tend to work with the image, not so much the symbol. It's something that is like a mirroring something that they already have an idea of, and then say, hey, that fits. And then you relate to that group because everybody's mirroring. You know, they even might have the photo of the cult leader on their chest, on a chain.
Yeah.
And the intention is often very, very good, and so on. I'm not talking about that, and they give wonderful stories too. But what is missing is this a bit of spice and juiciness of what reality is like. To bypass that, that's what is missing. So they tend to fall into mirroring, which is often much more of a narcissistic thing. You mirror each other and you can keep looking at yourself rather than having a place in the world. So they tend to become an in-group and so different from the rest. That's not a good sign, really.
So when you're talking to a client about the shadow, how would you talk to a client about shadow?
It's usually something that comes up from, as Jung pointed out when he wrote about the shadow from the start, he would say, well, you can recognize it often enough if you do something that is actually unconscious in you, but you see it in the other. So it's usually the other where you see, well, that person is so terrible, this and this and this and this and that. So you see the shadow. But what about your own reaction? Doesn't your own reaction start to become a bit like what you're actually criticizing? You become so aggressive, and you're accusing this other person of being so aggressive. What is that emotional loading that you feel so strongly? That seems to be a little bit out of place. What is that in you, that aggression? Shall we look at that? And then, of course, you have to talk about, well, what is true about the other person that is being criticized, but also what is true about you being so aggressive. And what does that relate to, actually? How did that shadow part of you get its own life that you seem to be, well, not quite aware of it, how strong it is, that it can take you to places that you don't really want to go to. But it's happening all the same. It's happening at collective levels as well. But I think nowadays it's clearly constellated. If you think about, a phenomenon like in the US with the press and the Russia Gate, for instance. So you say, oh, it's all about Russia, and you keep saying that, but you're not saying, well, actually, we were colluding ourselves to influence the elections and meddle in such a way
Mm.
that it's actually us who are colluding.
Mm.
And all the things that are coming out now, which
Right.
were already happening for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm.
There was clearly the person, one accusing the other of something that they were doing themselves. A bit like what happens in Hamlet. You get accusing and not seeing that it is his own shadow that he was not admitting to.
Mm-hmm.
And things can go really wrong if you don't admit that.
Yeah.
If you do admit it, like King David, he had you could say Uriah was one of his sergeants or military people, and he was very keen on his wife. And then Uriah went away, and things went all wrong. But he could later show remorse for having cheated, betrayed his military official Uriah. Then you can say, well, you've seen the shadow. You've seen that you yourself can actually do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you rationalized it and say, oh no, I'm doing good for the woman too, etc. But you've rationalized, but you've now seen it and you show remorse. If that doesn't happen, you get stuck with the shadow and it remains unconscious. And it starts to turn against yourself. Whether it's in Hamlet or whether it's in that say certain political parties that are colluding and doing something that actually leads to betraying certain principles. And you say, well, hey, your shadow is right there. Don't deny it.
And so what does it look like, just so folks understand, what does it look like when your shadow turns on yourself, as you're saying?
I think then you start to become, you can become more cruel than you think you are. People who become sharp, make a joke, reaction, say, oh, this and this and that. And the partner also feels very hurt and says, what you were just saying was very hurtful. Oh, I was only joking. What was actually funny then? Nothing. There wasn't anything funny. So people do things in a jokey way, but they're actually saying hurtful things. And if they see that, if they can see from what you actually said, was it really funny or was it meant to hurt? Mm-hmm. Yes, I actually wanted to give my partner a dig there. So if you don't admit that you were doing that, then it becomes difficult to talk further. But if you admit it, you can talk about, oh gosh, what was happening there? Oh, that seems to be a pattern that you do that in a certain way. Some people do it in a passive-aggressive way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you can point out, oh, that's another way of doing it. You're not doing something, or you're resisting all the time, and that way you can get to your partner. But really, what is it actually that you want to say? make the shadow conscious and talk about it. Yeah. Then you can integrate it and make something more constructive of the shadow. Use the aggressive energy, for instance, can turn into something constructive when you've integrated it. And you become creative, or you become much more assertive than you were before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. I think how many people need to integrate their aggression. They need to integrate their assertion. They need to integrate that kind of energy. I was just reading something that Neumann wrote about that.
Neumann. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
And so that can be part of the shadow, obviously, for folks that are watching.
Yeah, indeed. You can be glad if you start to recognize your own shadow, because it opens up a lot of possibilities for strength and good energy. Yeah, energy.
Yeah, and that's the difference from understanding it as a concept versus understanding it as something that is living in us very much.
Yeah.
That to change that is to change, the power that's moving through you.
Yes. Yes, and in therapy, when you say, oh, well, how do you recognize it? It's usually something that you feel. Say the therapist might feel it, and the client who is, say, being passive-aggressive in the therapy session might not feel it.
Right.
But you feel it and, oh, gosh, what's happening here? And if you trust each other well enough, you have a good enough working relationship, you can start to talk about it.
Yeah.
You know, or you can talk about the defensiveness around it. And then if you understand it doesn't matter that everybody has their defenses,
Yeah.
then it's much easier to carry on. So after a good working relationship, all this will fall into place usually.
Good. Well, that seems like a great place to wrap up. It was great to speak with you. I hope folks enjoyed the video, and more soon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gary. Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.